So what we mainly covered in the last meeting, we started out, first of all, I'm glad to see that you've been getting all of your journals in. You had me real nervous there when I wasn't getting anything in the beginning.
I had no
No?
idea about them.
Yeah. So, but now I'm getting them, and so you're golden, and we're in good shape. Um, I do want you to remember that we do have that this fourth quarter does count for grades. I'm not sure whether or not it's going to turn into like a pass fail at the end of the year. I would almost, I guess it kind of depends on if we go back to school or not. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
if we end up all back in school, then you're going to end up with grades. If we end up not going back, it's very likely it'll turn into a pass fail thing, but you have to have the stuff in to pass. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So, all right. So, what you're going to be doing this week is still continuing those journals. You have one more week of the journals. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I think it's all on that calendar that I sent out. And I imagine you probably have the calendar, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay. But what I want to start going over is what the next thing that we're doing is. And you're reading The Old Man and the Sea, which is going to be perfect. You know what I mean? For everything that we're doing next. But it is that a lot of times in colleges and stuff, they expect you to be able to do this thing called literary criticism, right? And literary criticism is what I want to kind of go over so that if you go to college, in the fall or whatever, that you're not blindsided by what it is that they're expecting from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so this next unit, what we're going to do is I'm going to try to share this screen with you so you can see my PowerPoint, and I'll go through the PowerPoint with you, and you can ask questions. I know you're going to have questions, like, as we get into the unit. You know what I mean? Like, I would be shocked if you didn't. So I want to go over it first here, and then next week we'll kind of talk about the specific ones that you're going to be doing that week. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So I'm going to find this this thing here that I want to share with you. There it is. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And I'm hoping that this is all. Let me check something really quick. I want to make sure that we are recording. We are. Okay. So I'm going to put that back up again. Sorry. All right. So we are going to be doing, initially what we were going to do is have you look at this literary criticism thing. And you were going to do like a poem, and you were going to do this short story of an hour. And then you were going to do a poem of your own, and you were going to do like your story. You know what I mean? Like you're reading The Old Man and the Sea. That's what we were going to do initially. But right now we're just going to do story of an hour initially, and then we'll see what happens as far as whether or not we're back in school or we're not back in school. But I'm hoping then that you will then write one literary criticism at the end. After, you're going to write one, kind of a shared one that we're going to do on story of an hour where we can all talk about it. And then you'll do one that's on the thing that you're reading. So you would do it on Old Man and the Sea. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So what it is the critical theories are like a lens that you look at something through. So you think about certain aspects of your story and just those particular aspects, and you talk about that one particular thing when they do it. So it's almost like I'm asking you a question. You know what I mean? And all I want you to do is think about, so I might say, I want you to think about Santiago. and what his blah, 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 right? Or
Yeah.
I want you to think about this in terms of power struggles or something like that. All of
So
those are, what was it?
uh like the whole like his view of the fish, would that kind of be like an example of it?
Well, I think we need to take a peek at it, and I will, and I think at the end of the lesson, you'll understand a little bit more what I mean by this.
Yeah,
Okay.
'cause I know the fish stands for his like view on God and how he sees God through his eyes, and he uses the marlin as like the example.
Yeah, like that's certainly one interpretation you could have of that. Um, that that would fit into some of these, and I'll go through them with you, and I think you'll understand a little bit more when we're done. Okay,
Right?
but we're going to start out. Our lesson objective is that you're going to be able to identify critical theories and what you're looking for in each one of those types of critical theory, because there's a whole bunch of them that we're going to look at, and there's a whole bunch more than what I'm giving you, but I'm sort of giving you the ones that almost everybody is going to expect for you to understand or know. Okay, and then you're going to apply one, so you're going to choose one of those theories, and you're going to write one based on your short story. And time permitting, and depending on where we are and what's going on in this crazy year, you know what I mean, will depend on whether or not we get to write one about your story that you're reading also.
All right.
Okay. All right. So, like I said, we're looking at things through a particular lens. So we're thinking about certain aspects of things. So the first one that we're going to look at is this Marxist theory, which was really popular in the 1930s, and it still is all the way to today. Do you know who Karl Marx is?
Yeah.
Okay,
Kind.
so can you give me a quick rundown of some things about him?
Um, I believe wasn't he like not really liked because of his ideas by a lot of people?
Well, yeah, the U.S. didn't like him very well, especially during the Cold War.
Yeah, 'cause he went against what they said and published what he thought, even if it went against like the state or whatever.
Yeah, he was the guy who basically came up with the idea of communism and socialism. Okay,
Yeah,
so like, especially Cold War time, our country was not.
the best.
Yeah, we really didn't like this idea at all, right? So the basis of communism, and it doesn't necessarily work this way in real government because he just kind of came up with the idea of what it's supposed to be. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So he said that in these free market societies, like what we have, capitalist societies, right? That you would end up with some people who have so much money and all of the power, right? That they would treat the other people terribly. So all those super rich folks would no longer care about the other people. And eventually those people on the bottom, because there'd be more of them than there would be the super rich, right?
yep,
So
yeah,
the people on the bottom would eventually get fed up and they would say, no, we're not doing this. They would gather together and they would have a revolution. And that cycle would continue until everybody came to the conclusion that they were no longer going to have people who had more money and more stuff and more power, but that everybody would sort of work collectively, like in a commune, right? So they would all work collectively and they would all share the wealth. So that the person who's good at this would do their part, the person who's good at this would do their part, and not acknowledging that one part is more valuable than another part. And that's what true communism is. And then you don't really need leaders, you don't really need any of that, you just need everybody to agree to this system. So that's the concept of socialism, communism, Marxism, right? And it's not a bad concept, it just generally doesn't work. But that's mostly because people get greedy, right? Um,
Yeah.
so, so it generally doesn't work, but it's a nice thought. And that was what his thought was. And that theory is what you're kind of looking at this through when you're thinking about a story. So, what we're taught, one of the big questions you always ask is who benefits from this? So, when I'm done with this story and I think about what it meant, who gets something out of it? You know, whether they get power, they get money, they get prestige, they get anything like that. You know, does this really help out the elite people? Does it help out lower class people? You know what I mean? So like for you, Santiago, I wouldn't have said was a elite guy, right? He was a lower class guy.
Who's local?
Yeah, like he's real poor, right?
Yep.
So so when we think about him, um, he would certainly be in the lower class. And at the end of the story, do you think people have more respect for him or do they not?
No, the younger boy, I think, does.
Yeah, the boy certainly does, right?
Yeah.
But when
He's
we're
going
reading,
with
oh, I'm sorry, go
parents.
ahead. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. We were talking at the same time.
Say the younger guy or younger boy's going against what his parents said to help Santiago.
Yeah. And so this would be something where you would like think about that and how, you know, who benefits. When you were reading the story, we're going to read the story of an hour. And
Right.
the story of an hour is like a 2-page story. And it's not long at all. You're going to do like a little assignment on it, and then we're going to apply it to all of these different things. So you have to think about who are the characters in this, what is their class, how do they, you know, what does this, what do we see? And it has a lot to do with power here also when we're dealing with Marxism, okay? We're talking a lot about it. And basically he says who has the stuff has the power. And it's all about, and that's what the material dialect is who has the stuff, you know, money, power, resources, whatever, is who has power in anything. And he says, actually, all these other things, politics, laws, philosophy, and religion, are really just constructs that we come up with. But really, in the end, it's to get money or to get power. Everything, according to him, is based on economics. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And he's, remember how I said like he believed in sort of that cyclical nature where like there would be revolution and that revolution would take over in order, and then those people become the people in power, right? And then as they become too power hungry, then all of a sudden it's going to go back again to those people on the bottom being unhappy, and then they're going to have that struggle again, and then we'll have another revolution.
Happening over and over.
Yeah, and so that's what he says is the cyclical nature of society, that we're just going to keep on doing the same thing over and over again, and that always leads us to revolution. And this is where we really get into the power thing. So we talk about oppressed people, people who don't have, the have-nots, you know, and how do they revolt? When do they revolt? Do they revolt? And how do you see that when we're talking about this in the story? It's how do we see that revolt happen in the story? Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. And so here at the bottom, I have the big questions for you to think about. And the big questions are who benefits, you know, who gets something out of this. You also have to think about the social class of the author, you know, who's writing this. And you also have to think about who do the characters represent in the story. You know, are they supposed to represent poor people? Are they supposed to represent rich folks? You know, like who's being represented, and think about how are they being represented. Are all of the poor people being represented as being dumb and incapable, or are the poor people being represented as being the ones who really are the smart, strong ones. That's something for you to think about. Values, what values are being reinforced? Is money being the end all being reinforced? Is going out and being on your own and being really stoic, is that being reinforced? Is being a guy or a girl being reinforced? Do you know what I mean? Like any of those things, you know what I mean? Like all of that, make sure all of those things are what are being thought about. And then of course there's the interactions between the classes. So when we have somebody who has stuff or who has power, either because they have money or they have a position or whatever, how do they interact with the other people? So like in your Old Man and the Sea, you might want to think about how do the people at, back in the society, how did they interact with Santiago? How do they treat Santiago?
I think he's a job.
Yeah. Okay. So that's something that tells us something about how people treat this old fisherman who's been doing this forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we have to think about, what does Santiago represent? Who is he? Why is he the lead person in the story? When we read that short story, you're going to think about the classes doesn't always have to be necessarily like, do you live in a nice house or do you not live in a nice house? It can be something like, so the story that we're going to read is actually written in 1893, right? So when we look at it, there is going to be a husband and wife. But in 1893, were men and women really in the same class?
No.
Right? She doesn't have the right to vote at that time. They were fighting for it. That was actively happening in 1893. So, there was definitely a fight for women's rights, not women's rights the way we talk about them today, but women's rights as far as like being able to make choices and being thoughtful and all of that sort of thing, right? So that can be where we see an interaction of the power play between the classes as well. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So that's what you're going to do for the Marxist one. And then
this is after the calendar thing or during it?
If you look on the calendar, it's not this week, it's next week.
Okay.
It starts. Okay. So I'm going to just kind of overview all of them today. And then next week when we get on and do this, we can have this conversation again, but it can be more specific to, okay, I'm supposed to do Marxist, but I don't understand what I'm looking for. Does that make sense? So
yep.
Today I want you to just kind of get the idea of what all of them are, and then we'll move past that to the next step. All right, so the second one that you're going to do, and what we're going to be doing, like I said, is it's going to be like a chart that you're going to get, and you're going to apply it to that short story. It's like the 2-page short story. And in each one, you're going to find like, here are some quotes or some examples that would work, like if I were writing an essay that were Marxist theory. And this is why I would use those examples. And then the next day you'll do another one, but it'll be looking for this one, which would be New Historicism, right? And you'll go through each one of those different types, and you'll do one per day.
Okay.
Okay, so that's kind of how that's going to work. So this next one is New Historicism or Cultural Studies. And like you can see in there, historicism, so I bet you can guess what this is going to relate to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you probably need to know some history of the time period. So like I said, this short story was written in 1893. Okay, so 1893 is an interesting year. Actually, sorry, it was written in 1894. But in 1893, just, a few months earlier, had been that huge crash in the stock market and in money values and all that other stuff. So it was actually the worst depression the United States ever experienced, except for the Great Depression. And so they were in the midst of that. So that's an important thing to remember. We also were moving out west, right? So we were trying to conquer the West at this time. And we're starting to see lots of the battles between Indians and the United States Army and all of that sort of thing. So that's a prevalent thing going on in the world at that time. So we have a lot of people out of jobs, out of work, out of money. We also are pushing westward. And we also had at the same time, we have women who are starting to say, we really should have the right to vote. And we start seeing the women's suffrage movement is going, right? So they're all, you know, ganging together and trying to get the right to vote and trying to convince people that they should have those rights and that they should be able to do something crazy like have a job and be married. Because that was something that wasn't allowed up until that point. You know, you could have a job, you could be like a teacher or something like that, but as soon as you got married, you were expected to leave your job. So that's sort of the historical moment. And I want you to think about what that means as far as like power. What does that mean as far as, you know, how do we look at other people, other cultures, right? That's something for us to be thinking about when we're reading this story. And I actually did put up in Schoology, I put in Schoology, I put like a couple of links to like a timeline of the period and stuff like that. So you can look there if you want to. But I don't necessarily, you can also just kind of like Google something too, if you kind of want to know a little bit more about what was going on in 1893, in 1894. Because what this piece asks you to do is to connect the work to the time period. Okay, so they really believe, New Historics take this concept that it's all relative. So the reason why if I were to write a short story, I would be writing it because I live in this time period, in this place, and because of what I've experienced in life. And so because of what I've experienced, that's what's going to matter to me, and that's what I'm going to end up writing about. And here they're saying that you, in order to really understand a story, you have to understand the writer, you have to understand what they were, you know, their time period, you have to understand what they were living through, what was important to them, because that would inform their work, and you'll understand their work a whole lot more if you do. If you remember back to when we did Macbeth, you remember Macbeth at all?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. I often went for this kind of way of looking at it whenever I would sit there and tell you about things like why the witches were so bad and why Shakespeare made the witches so bad. It was because he had a king at the time that was doing witch hunts, right? So, and why were all of his characters, female characters, really good characters until King James came into power, and then all of a sudden all of the characters in his plays that were female suddenly became like evil, right? And
Yep.
so all of that would be saying that that's a new historical way of looking at things, saying the reason why he made these things or why he did this way was because he was looking at what was going on. And he was reacting to what was happening in his world at that time. Okay, so then that's where we say, what does the work tell us about the reader, the writer, or the critic? So, you know, what can we learn about the world of 1894 when we read Story of an Hour? What was happening? What was going on? And then it's talking about we interpret history, you know, when we live in history, so therefore we interpret it that way. And again, we are subjective interpreters of what we observe. That's kind of what I was just talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then when we do this one, there's going to be some questions. And if you find something that answers those questions, then you're on this new historical frame, right? You're doing it. One of the things you have to ask are the words that have changed meaning. You know, and I always think of the word savage, because if you talk about savage and the way we use it today, we talk about like a savage beast or something that's, you know, dangerous and goes out and kills things or whatever. But if you talk about the word savage in like the 1800s, they used that word to mean a person who basically wasn't a Christian, which is a really different meaning.
Yeah, just a
You know?
little.
So, so I think about that word and I'm like, that word has really changed meaning. So when I read somebody calling someone a savage, I really take that to mean something different than what, and it did have that meaning also. It had the savage beast meaning also at the time, but you know, it was a very different word. So you have to think about that when you're reading things. There's probably not going to be a lot of that in the particular story I'm giving you, but, and yours was, the one that you're reading right now was written in the 1940s, I think. Right? I think Old Man and the Sea was written in the 1940s. But then you have to think about what events are happening in your story, and does the work support those or condemn those? So does the author like what's going on, or does the author not like what was going on? You know, because if we think about Gatsby from last year, you know, was Fitzgerald, did he like the way people behaved and acted in the 1920s?
Not really.
Not really. And so we would go back and we would say they obviously didn't support what was going on because of, you know, and then find the evidence in the story. If there are political figures in the story, then obviously how they feel about the political figures and things like that is something that you need to look at. I don't think that's going to be in either your story that you're reading right now or in the short story, but that is something that also works within this. And when they say marginalized populations are just populations of people who, Santiago is marginalized. The other people in the main society of his little village don't really accept him. Do you know what I mean? So he's marginalized. And it's probably because he's older and because they see him as not being good enough, mainly because of his age. It can be that people are marginalized because people think they're not good enough because of their race or because of their sex or because of like any reason that you might see. But all of those would be things that you look at for new historicism. I got to answer a quick question from my daughter here, but and then we'll move on. What?
So on the sheet, on the stain you gave me, it says to do the homework 151, but you didn't give me the piece of paper, and on the thing in the LA, it doesn't give me the question.
Can I help you when I'm done with this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next one for us to look at is a thing called reader response. And what happens in reader response criticism, when we look at this, is this one says that you are going to read something and get a different meaning out of it than I am. Because each one of us brings our own backpack of what we have done and what our lives are like, and who we are when we read it changes how we understand something. But it also looks at how the author purposely manipulates us to feel a certain way about something. But how they manipulate us and how we feel about it is what really creates meaning. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So you like fishing a lot, right?
Yep.
And so since you like fishing a lot, you will read and understand Old Man and the Sea better than someone who's never been fishing before in their life. Right? You know what it's like to be out there sitting and waiting and waiting.
Boy.
Right? And waiting and hoping to get something. And you also know the irritation of what it feels like to come home empty-handed. Right? So we've all done this, and we also know what it's like to come home with a great big catch. But that person who's never been out doing this, doesn't know what that is, and will have a very different reaction to Old Man in the Sea. So this is what you think about something, and it's what makes you have a reaction to the text. So that's what you're looking for. So there might be a moment when you're reading a story and you're like, that really ticks me off. That thing really makes me angry. And now you're thinking about that as you're going. Or you might be like, this really made me happy, or this really made whatever. And so you're looking at what your reaction was to the text and what things gave you that reaction. And that's what you're looking for in reader response. And it says that the role of the reader can't be omitted. Readers make meaning. Okay, we make the meaning of a text. And that's why when I read it, what might really change my mind about Old Man in the Sea might be really different than what you take away as being important from Old Man in the Sea. And the big questions to ask on this one is, how does the interaction of the text and the reader create meaning? Okay, so what is it, what do you do, or how do you interact with this text in order to make it meaningful to you? So this is very much on you, like what matters to you, but you just have to say why it was and what thing it was that did it. A lot of times it's because of the particular words that they use. You know what I mean? Like when they call someone something, or they behave a certain way, or you think about what that fish looked like, or, any of those things.
Yeah.
So those are things you're going to say, that was the words. Those were the things that really gave me this feeling. And then how does speaking it change the meaning? Sometimes when you say it out loud, or you read something out loud, you have a very different feeling about it than you do otherwise. And that's a good time to really think about it. Like I said, you're going to have questions at the end because there's a lot of these.
Oh, good.
Okay. Post-colonial. Colonial times, we know that we had people going out from one country and going over and taking over other countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we put our flag in here, and so therefore it's ours. And then tried to take over the natives of that place, whatever that place was. And one of the things that people started to question, and that this was something that really started in the 1990s, when people started to really have this conversation a lot, is that they started to question this whole concept that history is written by the victors. The people who win the wars are the ones who get to write the history book and say what happened. And, so they started to say, is that really
what actually happened?
Yeah, is that really the way that really went down? And this always reminds me, like this is the one that I think of personally whenever I think about post-colonial, is I think about when I was a kid, the way Christopher Columbus was portrayed, right? He was this daring explorer hero who got into boats and told everybody, no, I believe the world is round, and I believe it enough. I'll get into a boat and I'll sail, and, had a few miscalculations, ran into the Americas, and made America the wonderful place it is today. That's what I was taught when I was a little kid. Right?
Yep.
And I mean, we made little boats of what boats looked like. I mean, the whole deal. now I know that he was searching for gold. He killed off an entire race of people. He, you know what I mean? He enslaved other people. You know what I mean?
Was good as he was made out to be.
Yeah, it wasn't what I had been taught as a little kid. He wasn't a hero. You know what I mean? Like, so this is where what I think of when I'm thinking about post-colonial. So I'm looking at things through that lens. So for here, you have to think about what are the attitudes of characters towards other people. Do they act like they're better than somebody else? Do they act like they, you know, all of those types of things of like what Columbus would have thought towards you know, the natives that he ran into. It has this really unique perspective on empire, and this idea that one group of people can control or take over another one, and it does focus on what is the suffering of the people. You know, so if there are people who are being ruled by other people, like one person gets to be in power and rule over other people, what is the end result of suffering that happens to those people? Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
So, and again, it's usually because you're looking at the constructs of society. This group of people, because of who they are, how they were born, gets to be in control of other people. And so that's what it is. And it does not glorify.
So could it, well, this would be like the Germans then?
Yeah, like the Germans, if they were doing this, we do not want to glorify what they were doing, right? It's anytime we kind of say this thing happened, this group of people took over this group of people, but it was not a good thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's one of them. It really deals with power. So whereas like Marxism, when we looked at Marxism, it dealt with money, right? And
Yep.
it says who has the money. This one is saying who has the power, and how do they use that power to hurt other people. So when you're looking at the piece of literature, if somebody has power over someone else, then you want to say, how does that hurt other people? And that power structure can be just a power structure, like who's in charge, or it can be based on their belief systems. You know, if one group of people believe they are better than another group of people for whatever reason, you know, that's going to be problematic. So here's what you do is for the questions, when you're the ones that you would answer if you're reading something, right? The questions are, how does the text represent oppression? Who is being oppressed? And does this have something to do with their identity, who they are either culturally, as far as something like, are they a Native American? Are they, you know, one of these people that were sort of taken over at some point in time or enslaved at some time, and that's why they're being treated that way? It can also be culturally, like how the culture views like women, or how the culture views, like any of those would work. And how does the text deal with difference? You know, some people are really good at handling people that are different than them. Other people are not. You know what I mean? Like some people, as soon as they see someone who's a different color or speaks a different language, or they just can't handle that, and they kind of freak out, you know, and decide we don't like them because of whatever. So how does the text, how is that dealt with? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. We're to the last two. And the last two are kind of similar to each other, but I want to also explain how they're not exactly the same. Okay. This one is feminist, and this is feminist 1960s. So 1960s is an interesting time. Women aren't fighting for the right to vote, but they are fighting for, they're not fighting for the right to vote, but they are fighting for the right to work, to be paid a similar amount of money, the right, like to be able to have a lot of equal opportunities, because in the 1960s, there wasn't sports for girls in school. There weren't, all of those things. And so they were fighting for all of those things to exist. So you have to think about, in a lot of ways, we're talking about how a text reinforces the oppression of women. And it's not always women. It's women more often than it's men. But it's all of those rules of what we believe a man to be or a woman to be and what they can do or what they can't do, and how does that reinforce those things? So if every single girl in the book is only a housewife, that's reinforcing the idea that women are supposed to be housewives. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. It also includes when we exclude them. So if you think about how many movies are out there, or how many things where the women do nothing but sit at home and they're not really the main characters. They're not really important in a lot of ways. So that's something. So here we're dealing with that patriarchal ideology, and we're dealing with sort of laws and rules and what women are able or not able to do, what men are able or not able to do. So if you're going to do it on the man side, it would be that like a man wouldn't be allowed to cry, or he has to support his family, or any of those sort of stereotypes, and how those things are hurting people in one way or another. And usually it's women, but sometimes we can go with this with men too. Okay. And how are the women portrayed? If we would think about back to Macbeth again, that's more where this type of a thing sits in. Eve, of course, we're talking Adam and Eve here, in the idea that women can be blamed for everything because they are the origin of sin and death. We sometimes see that. So if we look at any of the later pieces by Shakespeare after King James became then, this would be where this would come into play, this idea of women are the origin of sin and death. We can see it in The Witches and Lady Macbeth, that, Macbeth probably wouldn't have gone down that bad road and killed the king and everything if it wasn't for his crazy wife. Right? So, so that's when we see that. We're probably not going to see things quite this, we're not going to see things quite this obvious. Do you know what I mean in what we're reading? But this is something that is going to be there. And the idea of gender issues. So this is when one group has power over the other, but this is a very blatant one, and it's very much what are female activities versus male activities. So that's what we're dealing with in feminist stuff, is we're looking at how are men and women treated, and how do the stereotypes that we have and the things we allow or don't allow them to do hurt them. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so, and that's how this one is a little bit different. This one is Gender Studies and Queer Theory. This is the last one. So Gender Studies and Queer Theory, it no longer is dealing necessarily with what they're allowed or not allowed to do, as much as it deals with how we think about people. And that we have sort of, it talks about how we sort of marginalize certain groups of people because of sex or gender. And here we can be talking about people who are gay, we can be talking about men, we can be talking about women, we can be talking about transgender, we can talk about, any of those groups, and how we think about them, and whether or not we think that they belong or don't belong, whether or not they're the same as everybody else or not. And that's what gender studies is dealing with. And again, it's dealing with this idea of power. And it's whether or not you have power based on sexuality. And it's the way we talk about them. If we think that men have to be this, or we think that women have to be this, or if we think that a man is not allowed to be a fashion designer and be straight, right? If we make that kind of a generalization, that would be something that they would say, whoa, wait a minute, why can't you be straight and be a fashion designer and be a man? Or a hairdresser or something like that. And it's because we have all of these sort of ideas in our head. There's not necessarily rules against it, like there is in the feminist theory. It's not really rules. It's just how we think about things or what our expectations are. And it also deals with how one thing goes against another. So it can be these binary relationships, that we have one thing is good, one thing is bad. One thing does this one does that. A father is, and how it's different to be a father versus how it's different to be a mother. And having this idea that you're either or, instead of you can be kind of both with things. Mom has to be the one who changes diapers versus dad who has to be the one who does the discipline, right? Whereas I think we know in real life, to be perfectly honest, we probably all have to kick in, right?
Yeah.
So that's where that kind of comes in. And this also asks, where do the in-betweens fall? Where do the people who are transgender fall? Where do people who don't fit the stereotype, where do they fall? And these are the questions. What part of the text can be perceived as masculine or feminine? How does the work portray other sexualities? Is it a traditional narrative? What elements are binary, in the middle, etc.? Is this all making sense to you?
Kinda, not really this one, but you'll
Okay.
explain better as we go.
Yeah, and I realize I've given you way too much information for you to process all of this all at once, right? So what we are going to be doing is, and like I said, it's not this week, although you can start thinking this way this week. You know what I mean? Like what could I maybe apply to this? But we're going to, next week, we're going to start out, like I believe it's on Monday, that we're going to read this Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin.
Right.
Okay, so you're going to read that story and just kind of make sure you totally understand the story. And then the next day, we're going to start out with that Marxist theory. And then we can all talk on Zoom or whatever, and we can make sure that everybody's on the right track for that one. Okay? And then you'll also want to spend a few minutes researching the time period. I told you a little bit, but you might want to look up a little bit more. You don't have to take notes on the back of the worksheet. There is the worksheet that's coming to you. Otherwise, it's also on Schoology already for you to be able to read and go through each one of those things. And then after we're all done, we're going to make sure that we find evidence for each one of the approaches. And then we are going, this is some other ones that have been done. These are some other ones that have been done in the past. And so by people, so I want you to kind of read what a critical thing looks like. One of the critical essays looks like, so that you have an idea what it is you're supposed to do. You know what I mean? And then we're going to write like a 2-page, double-spaced 2-page critical essay on that Story of an Hour. And then we're going to hopefully apply that to the other one. So that's the next several weeks. We will not be even at this point if we really do go back to school on the 15th. You know what I mean? Like this stuff will happen when we get back. The other thing, just so that you know, The other thing, but this will happen if we do stay out longer, which I wouldn't be all
Sup-
that surprised. And then the other thing, we also had our presentations that we were supposed to do. If we really do go back on the 15th, we'll do the presentations when we get back to school. Otherwise, do you have yours on your computer?
I got the essay and all that completely, the final draft and all that done.
Okay, did you do the PowerPoint and everything? You had a
Um,
good chunk of it done.
I got most of it done. I'm not sure if I fully completed. I think I have like maybe 1 or 2 slides left.
Okay, so if you have your, if you have that, what will, if you don't, we're going to end up having you guys do like a 15-minute version, and on PowerPoint, there's a way to be able to record what you have, or else we can set up a time for you to do like a 15-20-minute Zoom with me, and I'll record it and we'll call it good for that. And I'll show you how to share. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So this one was a lot longer than what we usually go. We usually are only like 20 minutes, but there was a lot to get through in this particular one. So do you have any other questions or anything?
Nope.
Okay. I miss seeing your real face in class, but I guess this will have to do for now. So hopefully we all get back together again sometime.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice. All right. Well, then I'm going to get going because it's almost noon and I actually have a video I have to watch for the AP class. So I will talk to you in a week.
Okay.
Okay. And send me messages or anything. And if you are confused with anything or want help with anything, I can always set up like a one-on-one of these for that too.
Okay.
Okay. All
Yep.
right. We'll see ya. Bye.
Bye.